God had only freed our Jewish brothers and sisters from Egypt, it would have been enough. Now, to be clear, when I say if God had only, I'm not talking about a wish of something we hope will happen. I'm talking about a thing that has happened, that if this is the only thing that has happened, it would have been enough. If God had only fed them in the desert with manna, it would have been enough. If God had only sent his son Jesus to proclaim his love to the world, it would have been enough. If God had only desired to nourish and feed us and strengthen us in the Eucharist, it would have been enough. This is a kind of litany of gratitude that is typical of a Passover meal, where you remember Christ, God's saving work. Well, for the Jewish people, it would have been God's saving work, but for us, it's God's saving works through Christ. And remembering all these different ways in which God has loved us. And the thing that I hope you're seeing in all of these different examples of God's saving work is that each one is an incredible outpouring of love. All of them together is a clear sign of God's superabundant grace. That God's grace for us is full, complete. That he gives everything to us. That he wants us to experience his love so completely that he does all of these different things as signs of his saving work so that we can experience grace upon grace. One of my favorite things about the Gospel of St. John is the superabundance that is made clear as a theme in this gospel. It comes up over and over again. And just as an example, a few examples in John chapter 1, we hear this from him. From his fullness, from God's fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. In other words, from God, we've all received grace, this outpouring of love and goodness and life into our hearts. And then the very next chapter, what do we have? We have the wedding feast at Cana, where Jesus takes these 6 jars and the waiters fill them up to the brim, and Jesus turns the water into wine. He doesn't just give the wedding couple that's run out of wine a little bit of wine. Wine. He gives them more than enough. There's an outpouring of his grace that they have a superabundance of wine for the party. And then a little later in the Gospel of John, John 6, the bread of life discourse, there they are, the 5,000 people, they're all hungry. And all they bring is 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And Andrew even says, how could this ever be enough? And then, of course, Jesus does his thing. And he raises his eyes to heaven, and they distribute the food, and they all eat. This is one of my favorite details. When they had all had their fill. That's what I love about a dinner, by the way. When they had all had their fill, they gathered what was left over, and they fill 12 baskets full of leftover fragments of food. Jesus didn't just feed them, he gave them more than enough, a superabundant amount of food. And then, of course, later on in the Gospel, John chapter 10, what does Jesus say to his followers? He says, I came so that you might have life and have it with abundance. Christ wants us to experience life to the full, completely. And then, of course, in John 15, I came so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. Jesus desires for us to experience the fullness of his life, his goodness, and his grace. And I start with all of those things because then we have that wonderful verse we heard in our gospel tonight, a verse that I talk about every year on this holy night. It's probably getting boring for you, but Jesus loved his own, and he loved them to the end. He loved them fully. He loved them by giving everything. He loved them by pouring out his whole life for you and for me, by allowing his blood to be drained from the cross so that as he died, we can live. He loved them to the end. We're supposed to see how that to the end phrase is just like all of the other abundance moments in Scripture in the Gospel of St. John. This is an abundance. Christ has loved you abundantly. He loves all of us like this. And as we gather tonight, as we celebrate and remember all of that God has done for us, and we gather around this beautiful new altar, I couldn't even tell you, this is unreal, that this is our church. Thank you. What a gift. We gather around this beautiful new altar, and every time we come around an altar, what are we supposed to remember? We're supposed to remember Christ's sacrifice, how he loved us to the end. And we're also supposed to remember that how he is both priest and oblation. What is a priest? A priest is someone who offers the sacrifice. So in the Old Testament, for example, what was the Jewish theology of being healed and forgiven of sins? You would have someone bring a sacrifice, an animal for the sacrifice, usually a lamb. They would bring the animal, they would sacrifice the lamb, they would pour out the blood on the altar, and then they would sprinkle it on the people to represent us coming back to life. I know it sounds disgusting, but that's what it meant that's what the symbol was for, was being brought back to life, being healed from sin. So the priest offered the sacrifice at the altar. And what was the oblation? The oblation was the gift offered to the Father. The oblation was the thing itself that's supposed to be sacrificed. It was the lamb. And one of the things that we have to remember about this night, this one of the holiest nights of the year, is all of the gospel writers are clear. They all tell the story of this wonderful supper, how he took bread, blessed, and broke it and said, "Take, this is my body." And then he took the cup and he said, "Take, drink of it. This is my blood poured out for you." What's clear? What's clear is that there's no lamb. There's no lamb at this Passover meal. You have to wonder, weren't the disciples, the apostles themselves, weren't they confused? Where's the lamb, dude? We're celebrating the memorial meal where we remember how God saved us from Egypt and how we're supposed to sacrifice a lamb and put it on a door and remember how the Lord passed over and won us our freedom. And where's the lamb? There's no lamb. But there was a lamb. Because the lamb was Jesus. That's why there wasn't a lamb. That's why he said, "Take, eat, this is my body. Take, drink, this is my blood. Sacrificed for you." See, Jesus wasn't just the priest offering the sacrifice. He was the sacrifice itself. And I've been thinking a lot about this, especially, for those of us that were with us for the dedication mass. And Bishop Wolkowiak did a beautiful job. And he said something that stuck with me that night. And I went back and I rewatched this homily because I've been praying about it ever since. And every once in a while I hear a phrase I'm sure I've heard before, but it takes me a while. And so he said how we are all meant to be living altars. Living altars. I'm like, that's an interesting phrase, to be a living altar. So I've been thinking about that. What does it mean to be a living altar? And then later on in the Mass, and I'm going to read it for you. I put it in my Bible here just so I could get the words right. It's paraphrased a little to save time, but this is the preface before the Eucharistic prayer at the dedication Mass of an altar. Having become both true priest and true oblation. See that? True priest, one who offers the sacrifice and oblation, the sacrifice itself, Jesus. On this altar, we celebrate the memorial of the sacrifice that he himself offered to you. To who? To the Father. On the altar of the cross. Here on this table, we are fed by his body. We drink of his spirit so that we too become a holy oblation, a living altar. So that we too can become a holy oblation, a living altar. We too are meant to become a holy sacrifice offered to the Father as living altars in our world. You know, and one of the things when we think about this altar and what Jesus does for us, what does Jesus say in the Gospel of John? He says, unless you love like I do, unless you're willing to lay down your life for your friend, that's how you follow me. That's how you love sacrificially. A new commandment I give you, lay down your life as I have loved you. And how does he love us? By loving sacrificially, pouring out his blood for us on the cross. He allowed himself to be poured out on the altar of the cross. Notice in that preface, there's 3 altars. There's the altar of the cross where Jesus won for us our salvation. There's this altar where we receive from this altar grace upon grace, where Christ nourishes us with his very body and his blood and gives us that Eucharist to strengthen us every day. And then there's the third altar, which is all of us. How we are all called to love sacrificially in our world, to be a holy oblation, a living altar. Every time you deny yourself and love your child, you've become a living altar. Every time that you deny yourself and love your spouse, you're a living altar. Every time that we go out in our world and we deny ourselves and love those who are in need, we become living altars. We become, just like Christ, sacrifices offered to the Father. And I'll leave you with this. You know, for me, I think about how I do that, and I promise you, I know my weakness. I know there's times I'm impatient, I'm not as generous as I should be, but I promise you that I try to live as an altar like that I try to sacrifice everything for you. Sometimes I don't do it well. But the reality is, all of us are called to give everything to not just one another, but to Christ himself. Because look at that cross with me for a second. If he had only loved us like that, if he only poured out his blood for us there on the cross, it would have been enough. If he only gave us everything like that, it would have been enough. May we too be willing to give everything. The superabundance that he gives us, may we give it back to him. Because how could we ever repay a gift that is more than enough for us?